Hi students, it's Mr. Ramage, and today's lesson is all about the two hot wars that made up the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. For the purposes of this lesson, I'm going to be utilizing this standard from the state of Ohio. The Cold War and conflicts in Korea and Vietnam influenced domestic and international politics. So we're going to be looking at Korea and Vietnam in a very brief way as we connect back to the ideas of containment that the United States was practicing as part of this Cold War era. We'll also look at some international politics and a few small domestic issues that connected with both of these wars. So first, let's take a look at Korea and go back and talk a little bit about Korea's history. Japan had invaded Korea back in the early 1900s and occupied Korea during World War II. It also invaded parts of China as well, and Indochina, which we'll get to in a little bit. But at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union occupied the northern portion of the Korean Peninsula, and the United States occupied the southern portion of the Korean Peninsula. And both armies were there to oversee the surrender of Japan and the removal of all Japanese forces from Korea. Now, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, which kind of runs across the middle of the peninsula. So the Soviet Union is in the north and the United States is in the south. Now, the Soviet Union doesn't want to leave for fear that the United States will seize control of the entire peninsula, and vice versa. The United States is not going to leave because they're afraid the Soviet Union and communists will take control of the entire peninsula. So both the Soviet Union and the United States are going to install governments in their portion of Korea, claiming that it's a government for the entire peninsula. In the north, the Soviets are going to install a communist government and begin supporting and arming a North Korean communist military, while the United States is going to do the same thing, installing a pro-democratic, pro-US government in the south, and also developing a military force as well. Both of these governments are going to claim control over the entire peninsula. And oh my gosh, don't forget, in 1949, China became a communist nation. That'll be important moving forward. So, the United States and the Soviet Union eventually leave Korea, and not long after they leave, on June the 25th, 1950, North Korean forces are going to invade the South. And they're doing this, of course, with support from the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviets did not believe that the United States was going to intervene, so they went ahead and supported North Korea's invasion of the South. Soviets believed that the United States was much more focused on Western Europe, but, of course, the United States is going to intervene because of our policy of containment. If we allow North Korea to invade the South and bring a communist government to all of Korea, then we are failing at our job of containment. President Truman is going to go to the United Nations to seek aid and support for the South Koreans against the invading North, which the United Nations will commit support and help to. But the United States is going to take on the majority of the fighting. U.S. forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur will arrive from Japan to the Korean Peninsula just in time to help support South Korean forces at the city of Busan. So the North Koreans had pushed the U.S. and South Korean and UN forces down to the southern coast of South Korea, down to the city of Busan. And it's there where the United States is holding off the North Korean army and clinging for dear life at the city of Busan. Meanwhile, MacArthur launches a surprise attack up at Incheon, near the 38th parallel, as a means of distracting the North Korean army and forcing them to pull their forces back and engage this new invasion of U.S. forces. So MacArthur attacks behind enemy lines, successfully drawing North Korean soldiers from Busan over to Incheon. Following that successful invasion, U.S., UN, and South Korean forces pushed the North Korean forces further north past the 38th parallel, heading towards the Yalu River. The Yalu River is the border between North Korea and the People's Republic of China. the United States is encroaching ever closer to that border of communist China. So, China is nervous with so many troops on their border. China decides to enter the war on the side of North Korea, which they do on November the 25th. 300,000 Chinese troops cross the river and join the North Korean forces against the US, UN, and South Korean forces. They are able to successfully push the Americans back to the 38th parallel, where things begin to sort of bog down. Now, MacArthur wants to expand the war further against China. MacArthur asks for the authority to use nuclear weapons, to bomb China, and to take the war to them. MacArthur is there to win, not to play this limited warfare that he feels is being forced upon him by President Truman. So MacArthur wants to win the war, while Truman is playing a sort of different game in this war. MacArthur is going to publicly criticize the president and his decision to, again, utilize the strategy of a limited war. In a limited war, your objective is to simply contain communism. The United States doesn't necessarily have to win this war. It simply has to prevent communism from spreading to the from the north to the south. Whereas MacArthur believes in this idea of, total victory. This is what warfare is supposed to be. You are supposed to defeat your enemy. You are supposed to use any means necessary to complete your objective, the destruction and the surrender of your enemy. Well, after making too many public comments about the president and being too publicly critical, President Truman fires MacArthur in April of 1951 for insubordination. We don't have the time to necessarily go through all of that, but it is a pretty interesting situation. So as the war in Korea drags on, we actually are going to have a new president. In November of 1952, former commanding general of Allied forces in World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, will become the next president of the United States. And Eisenhower is going to have a slightly different approach than Truman. Eisenhower is a military man. Truman was not. He was a civilian. So Eisenhower has a little bit more expertise in this area. And upon becoming the president, lays out some pretty big hints to the Chinese and the North Koreans and the Soviets that the United States may consider using nuclear weapons to end the war in Korea. And this was a tactic that was used by Eisenhower to help continue this conversation of some sort of peace agreement between the two sides. Basically, the fighting had pretty much slowed down by 1953, and both of the armies had settled in along that 38th parallel, and there weren't too many major engagements that were happening. On July 27, 1953, both sides agreed to an armistice. An armistice is a ceasefire. It is by no means a peace agreement. The war is not over, it's just the fighting that is over. In the armistice that is signed, the 38th parallel is identified as the border between the two nations, and a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, is created. And this is where neither side has control of that territory, and neither side is allowed to establish any weapons or have any occupation of that area. And this is the way things are today in 2023. We have the nation of North Korea and we have the nation of South Korea. North Korea is still a communist nation, and South Korea is a democratic republic, still supported by the United States. The United States has bases along the demilitarized zone, and that border is monitored and patrolled every day by both sides. So technically, the Korean War actually is still going on. But America obtains its objective. In this limited war, we are able to prevent the spread of communism from moving into the South, but we are unable to stop the North from being a communist nation. So, yes, containment worked in terms of protecting South Korea, but containment failed by allowing communism to take hold in North Korea. So, some impact on the Korean War. The United States is going to begin a large military and nuclear buildup, as we now have to become much more willing to fight in order to maintain this idea of containment. Previously, the United States, through the Truman Doctrine, had provided aid to Greece and Turkey. We did not send troops. We provided aid through the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Western Europe and revitalize their economy. We did not send troops. The United States has used the Berlin airlift without fighting to protect the city of West Berlin. So Korea is really the first time that the United States has to put soldiers into a fighting scenario. So the United States has to be prepared to do that in future events. The Cold War is now also going to expand into Asia. Early in the Cold War, we were more focused on Western Europe and communism spreading from the Soviet Union throughout Europe. Now we have to be more wary of countries in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific as communism spreads from China. The United States, in order to protect this part of the world and to practice their policy of containment, are going to sign defense agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Also, the United States is going to organize the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, which is very similar to NATO, the military alliance of Western European nations and North American nations. SEATO will be a very similar treaty organization in 1954 to protect communist expansion in Southeast Asia. And the United States is going to be beginning to aid France as it fights against communist forces in a place called Vietnam. We'll be getting to that place pretty shortly. But for now, let's stick a little bit with President Eisenhower as we take a look at a map of SEATO. So Eisenhower is going to go sort of all in on nuclear weapons, saying that, quote, the United States must be prepared to use atomic weapons in all forms. And Eisenhower is going to believe in what's called massive retaliation, that the United States will use its nuclear power and use its nuclear weapons as a threat in order to deter war. And Eisenhower is going to do this on a couple of occasions, what we'll talk about in a few minutes. But Eisenhower believed in this nuclear triad. He wanted the United States to be able to successfully use its nuclear weapons on any nation in the world at a moment's notice. So the nuclear triad was made up of three ways in which the United States would be able to deliver nuclear weapons against a potential enemy. Number one is the B-52 bomber. This is a long-range bomber, a transcontinental airplane that can fly at high altitudes and over extremely long distances and deliver nuclear payloads to pretty much any nation in the world. The United States is also developing its missile program and develops a number of ICBMs, like the Atlas rocket here. These intercontinental ballistic missiles are capable of reaching any part of the planet in 30 minutes. So they can be launched from the United States or from a number of bases around the world that the United States has access to. And these missiles would launch and within 30 minutes strike their target and deliver a nuclear payload. The United States also is going to develop nuclear submarines, which are also going to be capable of launching nuclear missiles and nuclear warheads, again, from anywhere on the planet. So these submarines will be out and sailing around and at any moment could launch nuclear weapons at anybody. So this is the nuclear triad of President Eisenhower, and it's pretty terrifying that the United States has these types of capabilities and is using it to threaten the Soviet Union and other communist nations around the world. Now, by doing this, Eisenhower is able to reduce actually the size of the United States Army. It gets a bit smaller when he becomes president, and the budget for the military drops significantly from $50 billion to $34 billion. Still a tremendous amount of money, but he's able to reduce the cost of the military by increasing the number of nuclear weapons. In 1953, the United States had 1,000 nuclear bombs. By 1961, just 8 years later, it's going to have 18,000 bombs. Now that's great, but it's also going to exacerbate the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is not going to sit back and let us develop 18,000 nuclear weapons without also increasing the size of its nuclear arsenal. So by Eisenhower increasing America's reliance on nuclear weapons, it forces the Soviet Union to do the same. Just like Eisenhower is going to increase the number of American bombers and nuclear submarines, the Soviet Union is going to do the same thing. So as much as the United States is practicing this use of nuclear force as a deterrent, the Soviet Union is doing it as well. This becomes extremely dangerous. 3 other things to understand about Eisenhower and his presidency and his approach to the Cold War. Eisenhower practiced what's called Brinkmanship. And Brinkmanship is this willingness to go to the brink of nuclear war in order to force your enemy to back down. Again, this is very dangerous. If your enemy believes that you are truly willing to use nuclear weapons, then they're probably, hopefully, we hope, going to back off and listen to what you say and probably negotiate some type of agreement or settlement. This is used by President Eisenhower in 1954 against the Soviet Union during what was called the Taiwan crisis. We're not going to go through this right now, but essentially Eisenhower said you need to back off of Taiwan or the United States is going to use nuclear weapons against you, which worked. He also does it in 1956 during what's called the Suez Crisis over the Suez Canal in Egypt. Same thing, the United States threatens the use of nuclear weapons and nations back down. Now that's pretty terrifying, but again, at some point somebody might, overly challenge you on this, right? So can you do brinkmanship all the time? I don't know. Eisenhower also is going to have Congress draw up what's called the Eisenhower Doctrine. Communism and the threat of communism was spreading to the Middle East. Again, we're not doing a deep dive on everything Cold War related, but the Soviet Union was trying to establish control over nations in the Middle East, which of course is valuable to everybody because of the oil that is there. After a few incidents and after a few governments begin to receive aid from the Soviet Union, the Eisenhower Doctrine is created, giving Eisenhower as president the use of military force to stop any communist expansion in the Middle East. So much like the Truman Doctrine provided aid to nations fighting against communism, the Eisenhower Doctrine does that, but also not just provides aid, but also the use of military force. So America is becoming much more ready and willing to use military action rather than simply aid and money to stop the expansion of communism. Also, during Eisenhower's president and beyond, we're going to use covert operations through the CIA. The CIA is the Central Intelligence Agency. This is sort of America's international organization that keeps tabs on what's going on around the world. But throughout the 1950s and 1960s and beyond, the CIA is going to engage in these covert or secret operations to overthrow governments who were anti-American and to replace them with pro-American governments. Again, we're not going deep dive into this, but the United States did some pretty shady stuff in terms of taking countries and governments down from within. In 1953, famously in the nation of Iran, and in 1954 in Guatemala. In both of those countries, pro-communist governments were replaced with pro-American governments, and all of those things were carried out by the CIA. Now, in 1957, we're going to add another component to the Cold War, and we are going to introduce what's called the space race. Because the world is shocked and in awe in October of 1957 when the Soviet Union announces that they have successfully launched the world's first artificial satellites into orbit around the Earth. And that is called Sputnik. So in 1957, the Soviet Union takes the big step in the space race against the United States, launching Sputnik, just about the size of a basketball, up into orbit. And the United States is 4 months behind them before it launches its first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. So this was very shocking to the U.S. and takes it as a big loss. The U.S. was losing the Cold War to the Soviets and losing the space race to the Soviets. They're smarter than us. They're better than us. In 1958, President Eisenhower is going to establish NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, to develop this civilian space program and to hurry up our movement to control space, right? Because that's a big deal. If you can put a satellite into space, why, you could use that satellite to do all sorts of things. You could spy on your enemies. You could gather intelligence and information. You could even use it as a means of deploying weapons, potentially. So, controlling space is a huge part of the Cold War and a huge part of the space race. American schools are seen as failing and behind the Soviets, so more math and more science classes are put into place. More standardized tests are put into place to measure the intelligence of American students. That's why we have all of these graduation tests today. It all comes from the Cold War. And then on April the 12th, 1961, the Russians become the first nation in the world to put a man into orbit. The Russian Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man to successfully orbit the Earth. So again, the Soviet Union takes the lead in the space race. And the space race is going to go on and on and on. And it's super cool and it's super awesome. And there's been a ton of movies about it, which you can check out. But basically, the goal ultimately is to land on the moon, which America does successfully in 1969. Which is pretty crazy if you think that the first airplane that was flown in the early 1900s. Within the period of about 65 years, we went from flying the first plane to landing on the moon. It's pretty amazing. If you are following along on the Google slide for this presentation, there's a link here on this slide for a video about the space race, which you can check out. It's not important that you know a ton about it. It is interesting, though, so feel free to check it out if you'd like to. Now, on to our last and another huge topic in the Cold War, and that is the Vietnam War. And this is going to get a little complex here, so I'll try to simplify it, and you can stay with me. So, Vietnam is in a place that was at one time called French Indochina. And Indochina was made up of three countries: Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And the French had taken control of this part of Southeast Asia in the 1800s and had it as a colony. Fast forward to World War II, the Japanese had invaded this part of Asia, kicking the French out and taking control of Indochina for itself as part of its Japanese empire prior to the start of World War II. Now, in Indochina, there was a gentleman by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist, and in 1930 formed the Indochinese Communist Party and was fighting against the French, trying to establish a communist government in Vietnam and the rest of Indochina. Well, when the Japanese invade and take control of Indochina, Ho Chi Minh fights against the Japanese. As a way to counteract the Japanese, the United States is actually going to send aid to Ho Chi Minh and his troops called the Viet Minh as they fought against the Japanese. So during Japan's occupation of this territory, Ho Chi Minh, a communist, was receiving aid from the United States to fight back against the Japanese. Well, as we fast forward to the end of World War II, the United States defeats Japan and Japan surrenders all of its territories, including Indochina. When this happens, Ho Chi Minh declares that Vietnam is now an independent nation and free of anybody's control, no longer belonging to the Japanese, and especially not belonging to the French. Well, the French weren't exactly in agreement with this, and French forces returned to Vietnam after World War II to reclaim the territory and defeat Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh then regathers his forces and fights against the French government. Now, the United States, as a means of containment and stopping the spread of communism, is going to send aid to the French against the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh. So previously, the U.S. had funded Ho Chi Minh against the Japanese. Now we're funding the French against Ho Chi Minh. I know, it can be a little complicated. But if you remember containment, it makes sense. Now, we need to talk about a theory that the United States had developed about Asia and communism called the domino theory. So we have already seen communism spread into China, and we've seen communism spread into North Korea. The domino theory was the belief that if Vietnam fell to communist revolutionary Ho Chi Minh, and if he was able to successfully establish a communist government in Vietnam, then the rest of Southeast Asia would also fall, like dominoes, to communism. So the United States, in terms of containment, is going to have to stop communism in Vietnam in order to make sure that communism doesn't spread any further. Now, despite the fact that the U.S. had sent lots of money to aid the French in their fight against the Viet Minh, the French are defeated in May of 1954 and withdraw from Vietnam. At the end of that conflict, we're going to have what's called the Geneva Accords. Now, in the Geneva Accords, they made a couple of decisions about what to do with Vietnam. Vietnam was going to be divided at the 17th parallel, so very similar to Korea, which was divided at the 38th parallel. Vietnam is going to be divided at the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh under the control of the northern part of Vietnam, and Ngo Dinh Diem controlling the southern portion of Vietnam. Diem will be supported and funded by the United States, as he is extremely anti-communist and opposes the communist government of Ho Chi Minh. Also, according to the Geneva Accords, in 1956, there was to be an election. That election would be held in both the North and the South, and the election would determine the future of the Vietnamese government. That it was not going to be a North and a South, but rather one nation united under one government through these elections in 1956. Now, Diem refuses to hold elections for this, believing that Ho Chi Minh is going to win and Vietnam is going to become a communist nation as a whole. Now, the U.S. is going to support and aid Diem because in 1961, North Vietnam is going to attack South Vietnam. By 1961, the Viet Cong is going to control most of the South. Now, the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh are different. The Viet Minh were the soldiers of the northern part of Vietnam. The Viet Cong are southern Vietnam forces that are fighting for the north. Okay, it's a little confusing, I know. Now, as the Viet Cong begins to control more and more and more of the southern portion of Vietnam, U.S. aid is going to increase to southern Vietnam under President Kennedy. Now, at this point, the United States is not sending any combat troops, but rather advisors and military personnel. The objective is to train the South Vietnamese army to fight and defend itself. In 1961, Kennedy had sent 2,000 military advisors to Vietnam. By the end of his presidency in 1963, there's going to be over 15,000 U.S. personnel in Vietnam. Also in 1963, due to some pretty terrible, pretty bad decisions and terrible leadership, Ngo Dinh Diem is going to be overthrown and executed by his own generals, leaving the government pretty much in turmoil in South Vietnam. Super cool story, no time to talk about it. Also, of course, in November of 1963, on November 22nd, President Kennedy is assassinated, leading us to the next president to take control of what's happening in Vietnam, and that's President Lyndon Johnson. President Johnson is going to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam and begins ordering attacks on North Vietnamese naval positions. So U.S. ships and planes are going to begin to attack the North Vietnamese Navy. In August of 1964, there's an incident between a Vietnamese ship and an American ship that supposedly the United States is fired upon by this Vietnamese ship. Following this incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, President Johnson has Congress draft what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This essentially gives the president the powers to, quote, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. So essentially, President Johnson is given a blank check to do whatever is necessary to defeat the North Vietnamese. And the first action that Johnson takes is to begin bombing North Vietnam. By March of 1965, almost a year later, about a half year later, Johnson is going to begin ordering U.S. combat troops to Vietnam. So now instead of military support and advisors, instead of just money, instead of just aerial bombardments, Johnson is going to order combat troops to Vietnam. A year later, by 1966, there are 385,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. Now, the war against the Viet Cong was very, very, very difficult. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics against the United States. They were able to blend into villages and hamlets throughout the South. They did not wear traditional uniforms. They were indistinguishable from the civilian population. They used hit-and-run attacks and all sorts of booby traps and all sorts of really wicked and terrible tactics to fight back against the Americans. And despite the fact that the Americans have the superior firepower and the superior materials, fighting against the Viet Cong proves to be disastrous. The war is not going well. The draft that is instituted by Johnson during the war is extremely unpopular at home. The United States population is seeing the Vietnam War on television, which is broadcasting the war nightly on the news. They're seeing what's happening firsthand in real time. The casualty numbers are increasing. Soldiers are returning home. Coffins are returning home. There doesn't seem to be an end in sight to the war, and the war becomes extremely unpopular in the United States. Protests are common on college campuses in all sorts of places. There's a young generation that's grown up post-World War II that's not happy with the war, not happy with what the government is doing, not happy with the draft or the treatment of the soldiers and the Vietnamese people. Anti-war protests are happening throughout the country. Veterans especially are coming home and protesting the war. That sends a huge message to the people of the United States when the veterans themselves don't support the war efforts. Draft cards are burned publicly, which is a federal offense and crime, but people were willing to do that to protest the war and not support it. Again, we can go on and on and on about the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, but we're going to push on and get through this war here. Johnson serves out his term, and in 1968, we have another president who comes in to wage the war in Vietnam, and that's President Richard Nixon, who's elected in 1968. Nixon promised the American people peace with honor in Vietnam and began a process called the Vietnamization, which would be the gradual removal of U.S. troops from Vietnam and putting more emphasis on the South Vietnamese taking over the fighting and handling the war moving forward. This is a process that the United States recently also did in Afghanistan, and just like it not working in Afghanistan, it's not going to work in Vietnam either. In response to the decline of American troops, Nixon actually increases the bombing of North Vietnam to try to knock the North Vietnamese out of the war, and also begins the secret bombing of the nation of Cambodia, where many of the Viet Cong have secret bases across the border. Nixon does not tell anybody, does not tell the American public that we are now bombing the nation of Cambodia, who we are currently not at war with. So that's pretty shady. And then in 1970, in April, the United States invades the nation of Cambodia in search of Viet Cong soldiers. So, yeah, we are bombing a nation and invading a nation that we're not technically at war with. That's not very good. All of these things come out in what are called the Pentagon Papers. All sorts of other shenanigans happen. Nixon ends up resigning, and it's just a whole big hot mess. But in January of 1973, the United States and Vietnam signed an agreement, quote, ending the war and restoring peace to Vietnam. And in this peace agreement, the United States will eventually withdraw its forces, and the war in Vietnam will be over. Now, back to the domino theory. What is going to happen once the United States leaves Vietnam? Well, the domino theory said that communism would spread, and they're absolutely right. In March of 1975, North Vietnam invades the South, taking the capital city of Saigon by April 30th. and taking control of the whole country, making it a communist nation. Earlier in 1975, Cambodia falls to communist forces led by a group called the Khmer Rouge, who are going to do horrible and terrible things to the people of Cambodia in a mass genocide. I suggest you look that up. It's terrifying and horrible. And in 1975, the nation of Laos will fall to a communist government. So all three nations that used to be part of Indochina will all fall to communist governments. So the domino theory was correct. And despite all of the years that America spent in Vietnam, it failed to prevent the spread of communism. So in terms of the cost of the war, again, we could spend a long time talking about this, but just a few numbers here to consider. The Korean War lasted from 1950 to 1953, and during that time period, we were going to see 33,000 U.S. soldiers killed in action with 103,000 wounded, 3 million Koreans killed in that conflict, and 5 million Koreans displaced by the war at a U.S. cost of $30 billion. Vietnam, looking at 1963 to about 1973, 58,220 United States soldiers killed in action, 153,000 wounded, about 2.45 million Vietnamese killed, and a total cost of $168 billion, which in 2023 would be $1 trillion. Plus, the cost of the war is much more than just the wounded and the killed and the money. There are tremendous other costs as well. So some key takeaways to this video lecture. Number one, the Korean War tested America's containment policy in Asia and did not result in a clear U.S. victory. So in this limited war, we simply prevented communism from spreading to the South. The United States under President Eisenhower expanded its nuclear arsenal as Eisenhower reduced spending on the military but increased our nuclear capabilities, going all in on nuclear weapons and developing his nuclear triad. Number three, the U.S. used the threat of nuclear war or Brinkmanship as a deterrent to war, threatening the use of nuclear weapons in order to get other nations to back down and to comply with what we wanted. The space race began as the Soviet Union became the first nation to launch a satellite and a person into space. The domino theory warned that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Indochina would also fall, which was a major reason for the United States' involvement in Vietnam over those number of years. Number six, the Vietnam War was a long and brutal conflict that resulted in conflict at home over the draft and over the war itself. And number seven, America's withdrawal from Vietnam does prove the domino theory to be true, as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia all fall to communism. Now, the Korean War and the Vietnam War are huge events in American history, and obviously we did not talk nearly enough about all of them. But hopefully this lesson will give you some better insight into how these wars are a part of the Cold War and how they are going to shape America's future moving forward. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something.